Story 1. It was around 4 in the morning when we decided to head out. The street was almost completely silent, except for the sound of our feet shuffling on the pavement and the soft crackle of the ball as we kicked it back and forth. It had been one of those nights, the kind where we were all just trying to pass time, laughing, making terrible jokes, and getting caught in a haze of whatever it was we'd been up to earlier. The world felt a little off balance, though. You know those moments where things feel almost too quiet, too still? That's how it was that night. We weren't really supposed to be out there, but we didn't care. It wasn't the first time we'd been up all night, running around under the cover of darkness, throwing a hacky sack in the air like it was some kind of sacred ritual. There's something about the early hours that makes everything feel secret, like you're part of something others don't get to see. I'm sure you've had nights like that, the ones where time almost stops, and all you can hear are your own thoughts and the distant hum of the world. But then, something happened. One of my friends, David, I think, was the one who kicked the sack too high. It hit the power line overhead and we all froze, staring at the tiny object as it hung there for a second. David went to go retrieve it, and that's when it happened. I can't even describe the scream. It wasn't like someone was hurt or scared. It was something primal, like raw, gut-wrenching terror. It came from the house just across the street. The sound pierced the night, cutting through the calm like a knife. It didn't sound human at first, at least not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't a scream of pain, it was something worse. It was the kind of scream that makes every hair on your body stand up. That kind of terror that comes from deep inside. Something pure, like instinct screaming for its life. We all stopped. Everything stopped. The house the scream came from was this old, worn-out place with overgrown ivy and cracked windows. I'd never noticed it much before. I'd always seen the house, but it had that quiet, unremarkable presence that made you think no one actually lived there. It was just there, sitting like an empty shell. But tonight, with that scream splitting the air, I felt different. The whole street felt different. "Did you hear that?" someone asked. But we all knew we heard it. David came back with the hacky sack, but his face was pale, his eyes wide. He didn't even say anything. He just nodded in the direction of the scream. We were all looking at the house now, the street lamp above us flickering like it was about to die. "What the hell was that?" Alex muttered, and I could tell his voice was shaking. But before any of us could say anything else, the light in the upstairs window of that house flipped on, bright and jarring against the darkness. It was so sudden, so out of place. The house had been completely dark before. Now it was like someone had just flicked a switch, and the light poured out into the street, casting strange shadows on the ground. We all looked at each other, unsure of what to do. The air around us felt thick, almost suffocating. I don't know why, but the street suddenly felt much smaller, more claustrophobic. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing and the sound of my friends' breath catching in their throats. "Should we call the cops?" David whispered. His voice was barely audible. I don't know why I said yes. It felt like the right thing to do, but also something about the whole thing felt wrong. But what else could we do? So I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. It only rang once before someone picked up. "911, what's your emergency?" the voice on the other end asked. I could barely form words. I didn't even know what to say. We heard a scream," I managed. "A really loud scream. It came from this house across the street, and there was a light that came on in the window after." The dispatcher didn't hesitate. "Stay where you are," she said, her voice flat, almost professional. "We've already received a call from that house. Officers are on their way." I didn't know what to make of that. The neighbors had called. Why hadn't we seen anyone come out of the house? "Are you sure they're okay?" I asked, my voice cracking. The dispatcher didn't respond right away. The silence on the other end felt heavy, like she was trying to decide whether or not to tell me something. Finally, she spoke again, her tone much more serious. "I don't have any further details," she said. "Please stay away from the area until authorities arrive." I hung up. I didn't know what to say to my friends. We just stood there, the tension so thick you could practically taste it. Then from inside the house, we heard something else. A soft shuffle followed by the distinct sound of a door creaking open. But we didn't see anyone. No one stepped outside. The light in the window flickered for a second, and then everything went dead silent again. I don't know how long we stood there, but it felt like forever. My mind kept racing. What had happened in that house? Was someone hurt? Had we interrupted something? The only thing I could think of was that scream. It echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that something wasn't right. Finally, we saw the flashing red and blue lights at the end of the street. The cops had arrived. We could see them get out of their cars and head toward the house. As they walked up the driveway, something strange happened. The light in the upstairs window went off. Just like that, it was gone. We all exchanged glances, but no one said anything. We didn't move. We didn't approach the house. We just stood there watching. The officers knocked on the door. They stood there for a long time, and then one of them peeked through the window. They didn't say a word as they turned around and walked back to their cars. The house? It was empty. There was no one inside. They didn't explain. They didn't have to. We never found out what happened. Story 2, I live in a quiet suburb on the outskirts of the city. My life has always been peaceful, routine. My daughter Lily has been in kindergarten for about 6 months now. She's a bubbly, playful little girl, always laughing and running around. The kind of child who makes everyone around her smile. My husband Mark works a lot, and I stay home with Lily. The days often blend together, but I always make time to pick her up from school in the afternoons. This particular day was just another ordinary one. Mark was away on a business trip, so I was on my own. It was around 4:30 p.m. when I decided to head to the school. I didn't think anything was out of the ordinary. The sun was already starting to dip low in the sky, casting a soft orange hue across the streets as I walked to the kindergarten building. As I stepped inside, I immediately noticed something was off. The room was empty, no parents, no kids, just a handful of stragglers sitting around, waiting for their parents to arrive. I scanned the room. 5 kids remained. None of them were mine. A small twinge of confusion pulled at my chest. Where was Lily? She should have been with the others. I approached Mrs. Whitaker, the teacher who was sitting by the window, her face tense. She didn't notice me at first, so I cleared my throat. Mrs. Whitaker, I called, my voice rising with a sense of growing concern. She looked up, her eyes distant. Oh, hello, Mrs. Lawson. Lily's been picked up already. She's been with the other teacher all this time. She left about an hour ago. I froze. What? My stomach dropped, a sick feeling spreading through me. I glanced around the room, now feeling as though the walls were closing in. The kids were talking to each other, oblivious, but I was caught in a web of dread. Picked up, I repeated, but I was supposed to. She's already gone, Mrs. Whitaker said, standing up, brushing her hands over her skirt. There were no issues. Everything was normal. You were late, and she left earlier with Ms. Harris. No, that's not right, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady, though every muscle in my body was starting to tremble. I'm on time. I was supposed to pick her up. You're sure she's gone? With another teacher? I knew something was wrong. Mrs. Whitaker's face, once calm and collected, seemed to lose its color. She blinked a few times, confusion flooding her expression. I'm not sure. I thought she was with you. She said it slowly, as though the words weren't entirely hers. That's when panic began to claw at me. Where is she? Where did she go? I shouted, my heart pounding in my chest. The room seemed to stretch out, the silence so thick it felt suffocating. Mrs. Whitaker seemed to snap back to reality, her hand trembling as she grabbed her phone. She dialed something, someone, and muttered something under her breath. Her eyes were wide, frantic. I knew she was about to call the other teacher, but my mind was already spinning, caught between the horrible truth and denial. Mrs. Whitaker, tell me where she is. My voice was sharp now, laced with the fear that was starting to paralyze my limbs. I'll go check with the front office, okay? She stammered. Just stay here. I'll find out. I'm sure everything's fine. But I couldn't stay still. Something was wrong. Something was so wrong. My legs carried me toward the hallway before I even realized what I was doing. Lily! I screamed her name, my voice cracking. The hallway was eerily silent. The walls closed in on me, shadows stretching unnaturally. There were no other voices, no laughter, no crying. only a thick, oppressive quiet. I ran down the corridor, calling her name over and over. "Lily, where are you?" My breath came in sharp gasps, and the air felt too thick, like it wasn't meant to be breathed. The silence in the building seemed to deepen with each step. I reached the coat room and threw open the door. No Lily. I raced to the front office, my heart now pounding so violently I could feel the beat in my throat. The receptionist wasn't at her desk. Her chair was empty, as though she had vanished. I pounded on the door to the principal's office. No answer. I turned, a wave of cold dread washing over me as I looked down the hallway to the back doors of the building. I heard something, a whisper almost. It was so faint I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. My pulse surged again, and my legs moved faster than I could think. I tore through the building, my mind frantically running through every possible explanation, but all I could see was darkness. Then, just as I reached the back of the school, I saw it. The door was open, slightly ajar. The cold air from the outside rushed in, but I didn't care. I didn't even pause. I pushed the door open and stumbled outside, the light from the street lamps casting long, jagged shadows across the empty playground. There was no sign of anyone, no children, no staff, nothing. I stood there for a moment, feeling the emptiness around me close in. A strange sense of déjà vu washed over me, but it was more than that. It was as if I'd been here before, as if this exact moment had happened long ago. Suddenly, I felt the ground beneath me shift, as though the world was turning in on itself. I turned back to the school, my hands shaking uncontrollably now, and then I saw her, Lily, standing by the far corner of the playground, facing away from me, her little body still as a statue. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and I felt a sickening twist in my gut. "Lily," I called, but she didn't move. She didn't even turn around. I took a cautious step forward, and as I did, the wind shifted, carrying the faintest sound to my ears, a low, garbled voice that wasn't my daughter's. I blinked, and in that moment, everything changed. The shadows shifted, twisting like fingers, reaching out to pull me in, and Lily's small figure, no, something else, jerked unnaturally. A cold, hollow laugh echoed through the playground, and that was the last thing I remember before everything went dark. Story 3. I'll never forget that day. It started out like any other Sunday, cloudy, quiet, and unnervingly still, like the calm before something awful. My mom and I were at my aunt's house, sitting in the kitchen and talking, but my mind kept wandering back to the hospital. Grandma had been there all week. The stroke was massive, and the doctors said there was nothing they could do. She was on life support, her body kept alive, but the doctors weren't hopeful. My mom was devastated, but she refused to leave Grandma's side. I don't blame her. I would have been there too if I could have. We sat there, the air thick with unspoken thoughts, when the phone rang. I remember exactly how it sounded, sharp, jarring, cutting through the stillness like a blade. My mom didn't hesitate. She grabbed the receiver with a look that told me everything. It wasn't the hospital, it wasn't the doctors. This call was different. "Hello," she said, her voice trembling. Her eyes locked onto mine, then widened. She said nothing, just stared at me, and I felt a coldness creep into my spine. I didn't know why, but something about her silence felt wrong. For a moment I thought maybe Grandma had finally, maybe she had made some miraculous recovery and the hospital was calling with good news. Maybe this was the call that would change everything. But then, my mom's face turned pale. She looked like someone had sucker punched her in the stomach, the color draining from her face in a way I'd never seen before. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice thick with confusion. She didn't respond right away. She just held the phone to her ear, frozen. I could hear her breath on the other end of the line, shallow and rapid. It was as if the world had suddenly gone silent, as though we were both waiting for something that was about to hit us like a freight train. I watched her face twist in pain, the way her eyes darted around the room, like she was searching for answers. But when she finally spoke, her voice shook like a leaf. She says she's okay, and she wants me to come to the hospital. She says she loves us." I could feel my stomach drop. "What? "Grandma?" But before I could say anything else, my mom's expression darkened. She quickly grabbed her purse, her movements quick and jerky, and without saying another word, she was out the door. I could barely keep up, the weight of the phone call pressing down on me. She didn't want me to go to the hospital. I was too young, she said. ICU wasn't a place for kids, and I wasn't going to see Grandma in that state, hooked up to machines and tubes. I stayed at my aunt's house, silently watching the minutes crawl by, the room growing colder as the air thickened with the feeling that something was terribly wrong. A few hours passed. I tried to keep myself occupied, but my mind kept going back to the call. My grandma wasn't supposed to be able to talk. She hadn't opened her eyes in days, hadn't responded to anything. She was brain dead. She wasn't supposed to be able to speak. But my mom had heard her. My heart began to race. I didn't want to think it. I couldn't think it. It couldn't have been her on the phone, could it? I tried to tell myself it was a glitch, some mistake. Maybe the hospital staff were trying to keep my mom hopeful, playing some sort of cruel joke. But deep down I knew this wasn't a joke. The phone rang again, breaking through my thoughts. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I did. "Hello," I said, my voice barely a whisper. It was my mom. I could hear her breathing heavily, like she'd just run a marathon. But it wasn't the sound of someone tired from walking. It was panicked, frantic. "Mom, what's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. The line crackled, and for a moment, I thought I lost the connection. I could feel my heart pounding, the silence in my ears deafening. And then I heard it. "I'm sorry," my mom's voice trembled. "She's gone. Gone." The word felt like a punch to the gut. I could barely breathe, my world tilting as if it was about to crumble around me. My grandma was dead. But then my mom spoke again, and the words she said chilled me to the bone. "I don't understand. She was talking to me, but she wasn't supposed to be able to. I don't know how, but she said she was okay. She told me she loved me." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could hear the fear in my mom's voice. This wasn't grief speaking. This was something else. It was terror. "Mom, what do you mean?" I stammered, my voice breaking. There was a long pause before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but I think it was her. I think she called me." My mind was spinning. The more I thought about it, the less it made sense. I could still hear the words, my mom's voice trembling, but what was even more unsettling was the call ID. It had shown the hospital number, the exact number of the ICU. The hospital had confirmed Grandma's death. They told us there was no chance. The machines were all turned off. So how had she called? How had she spoken to my mom? And why did it feel like she was still there? That phone call has never left me. I think about it every day, and I can't explain it. I can't explain why my mom heard her voice, why the hospital number showed up on the caller ID, or why, in the depths of that moment, it felt like something was trying to reach us from the other side. It's not the kind of thing you can ever forget. Some things, some calls, should never be answered. Story 4. I still can't shake the feeling. Even years later, every time I think about that night, it sends a cold shiver down my spine. I don't know how to explain it, but something happened that I can't put into words. Maybe it's better that way. I had been living in the city for most of my life. The hustle, the noise, the chaos. But a close friend of mine, Rob, had moved up north to a small town in the middle of nowhere a couple of years ago. One summer I decided to visit. I needed a break. Rob was always talking about the quiet life, the isolation, how different it was from everything I'd ever known. So when he invited me to go camping with a few of his friends in the forest, I jumped at the chance. The town he lived in wasn't much. It's one of those places you could drive through and miss in 5 minutes. You pass the gas station, a few rundown houses, and then you're into wilderness. But the thing that drew me in were the northern lights. Rob told me on clear nights you could see them right from his backyard. I had never seen them before, and I thought that would be a perfect way to experience the remoteness of the place. We left around 7 p.m. I remember thinking it was a bit late to start a camping trip, but Rob assured me it was fine. It was a 2-hour drive, and then we'd set up camp. As we drove out of town and into the forest, everything started to feel off. The road was narrow and winding, the trees thick and dark, and there was almost no other traffic. Just the hum of the engine, the occasional owl hooting in the distance. The world felt so still, it felt almost unnaturally still. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something on the horizon. At first, I thought it was a street light or a distant campfire, but then it flickered, and I realized it wasn't a fire at all. I gasped, "Rob, look at that! Is that the Northern Lights?" Rob smiled, but it was a weird smile, like he knew something I didn't. "Maybe," he said, but his voice had a strange edge to it, like he didn't quite believe what we were seeing either. We both leaned forward, watching the lights move across the sky, vivid greens and purples dancing in waves. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, but there was something unsettling about it. The way the lights moved seemed off, like they were in a pattern, or controlled. I don't know, maybe it was just the isolation messing with me. Rob pulled over to the side of the road, and we sat there for maybe 10 minutes, just watching. It felt like time stood still in those moments, like we were outside the normal flow of things. The air was cold, but not unbearable. It was peaceful, too peaceful. I could have sworn we had only been there for about 10 minutes when Rob suddenly said, "All right, let's get going. We're losing time." He started the engine, and we headed off again. But something was off. The moment we started driving, I noticed how dark the forest had gotten. The trees were closer to the road, almost like they were leaning in toward us. I felt like we were being watched. The drive dragged on, and by the time we pulled into the campground, I felt like we had entered another world. It was pitch black. I'm not talking about regular darkness. This was a kind of void. No lights, no fires, no sounds except for the crunch of gravel under the tires. "This isn't the place, is it?" I asked, peering through the windshield. Rob didn't answer, but he slowed the truck and turned the headlights off. We sat there for a moment, the only sound now the wind rustling through the trees. "Wait here," he said, getting out. He walked toward the trees and I stayed in the truck, feeling a growing sense of unease. It felt like an eternity, but Rob finally came back. "We're in the right place," he said, sounding more puzzled than I had ever heard him. "I think everyone else is already here." I followed him to the campsite, still unsure. It was so dark that I could barely make out the outline of the tents. Rob shouted a few times, but there was no response. I started to get really freaked out. No lights, no lanterns, nothing. It was as if the entire place was deserted. Suddenly, a flashlight flickered in the distance, and I saw a figure emerge from a tent. It was one of Rob's friends, Tom. "You guys finally made it," he shouted, and I exhaled in relief. "Where is everyone?" I asked, still feeling strange. Tom laughed. "They're all in bed. Thought you guys bailed on us, so we just turned in early." I glanced at my watch, confused. "But it's midnight." I felt like I had been hit with a brick. Rob looked at me, his eyes wide. "No way, we left at 7. We couldn't have been that late." But it wasn't just the time. I looked at my surroundings again, and something was even more off. The camp wasn't just dark, it was dead still. No crickets, no wind, nothing. I still don't know what happened. I know I didn't sleep through any of it. We didn't stop for more than 10 minutes, yet the time had disappeared. Rob and I talked about it for hours, but we never came to any conclusion. It felt like we had driven through some kind of time warp, a crack in the universe. Nothing made sense. It still doesn't. What really gets to me, though, is the way the night ended. After we set up our tents and settled in, I went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. The silence was deafening. I kept hearing these strange noises like whispers, but whenever I looked around, no one else was awake. I'll never go back to that place. Story 5. I remember that afternoon like it was yesterday. It was one of those cold, rainy days where everything inside feels damp and the air has that chill that cuts through your clothes. I was at my boyfriend's place, a huge old house that he shared with a bunch of other college guys. It was the kind of house that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. Crumbling wallpaper, floors that creaked at the slightest touch, and old wood that groaned in the wind. The place used to be a convent. and you could still feel that in the air. There was something heavy about it, like it held 1,000 secrets. But I'd been over there enough times to ignore it, until that day. We were just hanging out in his room, doing nothing special. It was one of those lazy afternoons where you just lie around, talk, listen to music. The room itself had a lot of character, a bunch of mismatched furniture and an old creaky closet that took up an entire wall. I never really paid much attention to it. It was just a closet, right? I remember hearing a faint scratching noise at first. It was so subtle that I almost thought it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind outside catching on the old windows. But then it came again, louder. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I looked at my boyfriend who was lying next to me, and he glanced back at me. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, a confused frown forming on his face. "Yeah, but it's probably just, I don't know, maybe a rodent or something." The scratching continued. It wasn't like the usual noises you hear in old houses. It was rhythmic, like something was trying to dig its way through the wall. The sound came from the closet. "Okay, now that's creepy," he said, sitting up. His voice was tense. "I'm gonna check it out." I didn't want to, but I stayed where I was. He walked over to the closet, the floor creaking under his weight with every step. When he reached the door, the scratching stopped. He hesitated, glancing back at me. "It's quiet now," he said. But then, just as he touched the handle, there was a sharp, sudden rattle. The door shook as if something, or someone, was on the other side, trying to get out. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice rising. My boyfriend didn't answer. He just flung the closet door open, and in that split second, everything froze. I swear I couldn't see much, but what I did see, it was enough to make my stomach drop. There in the darkness of the closet, two glowing eyes stared back at us. Not a cat's eyes, not any animal I could recognize. They were too big, too round, too unnatural. Before I could scream, my boyfriend slammed the door shut with a force that rattled the entire room. He turned to me, his face pale, his mouth slightly open, like he was struggling to catch his breath. "Holy shit," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, but the panic in it was clear. "What the hell was that?" I didn't know what to say. I couldn't even think straight. My mind was screaming, "Run!" I could feel every muscle in my body tightening with fear, every instinct telling me to get the hell out of that room, out of that house. He grabbed my wrist and started pulling me toward the door. "Come on, we're getting out of here." I didn't fight him. I couldn't. I don't know if it was the sheer terror of what we'd just seen, or if something about that house had started to seep into me, but I couldn't get out of there fast enough. We ran down the stairs. I heard the faint scratching again, this time closer. It was coming from the ceiling. I didn't even dare to look up. I just kept moving, my legs pumping as fast as I could make them. When we reached the bottom floor, we didn't stop. We bolted out the front door and into the rain, not even bothering to close it behind us. We were both gasping for breath, standing in the middle of the yard, drenched by the downpour. I looked at him, my eyes wide with shock. "What the hell was that?" I repeated, my voice shaking. He didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring back at the house like he was waiting for something else to happen. "I don't know," he said finally. His voice was distant, lost. "I don't know what the hell that was, but I'm never going back in there." I was still shaking, not just from the cold, but from the sheer terror of what we just witnessed. But it wasn't just what we saw that scared me. It was the fact that there was no explanation, nothing. There was no way to rationalize what had happened. The whole house felt wrong after that. We stayed out in the rain for what felt like hours, neither of us saying much. Eventually, I had to ask, What was in the closet? What do you think it was?" He turned to look at me, his face as pale as I'd ever seen it. "I don't know, but it wasn't human." We never went back to that house. I didn't even want to go near it again, and I don't think he did either. I kept hearing the scratching noise in my head for weeks after. It never really went away. And whenever I think about it now, I get this cold feeling in my chest, like something's lurking, waiting for the right moment to remind me that there are things in this world we just can't explain. Things that you're better off never knowing. Sometimes I wonder if that thing, whatever it was, is still in that closet. Maybe it's still there, scratching away, waiting for the next person to come in and find it. And that thought right there, is what keeps me awake at night. Story 6. I still can't explain what happened that night. I've tried to tell myself it was nothing, just an accident. But deep down, I know that's not true. It was something else. It was late, maybe around 2 a.m., and I was lying on my couch, half awake, eyes barely open, listening to the hum of the fridge and the distant sound of traffic outside. I'd been dozing off, my mind drifting in and out of sleep, when the thing happened. I remember the silence, the way everything just seemed still. It was like the world had paused for a split second, and then it hit. The lamp. At first I thought I heard a bump, like something small falling over. I tried to ignore it, but then it happened again, this time louder. A crash, like glass shattering. I shot up from the couch, heart racing. The room was dim, but I could see the faint glow from the streetlights outside through the curtains. I turned towards the bookcase. I had this little corner in my living room, nothing special, just a small bookcase with a few books, a couple of knickknacks, and this old brass lamp my grandmother had given me. I had spent years in this apartment, and in all that time, I'd never once had anything fall off the shelf, not even when I bumped into the bookcase or brushed past it. I knew it well, but now there it was. The lamp was lying on the floor. No way it could have just fallen. Not like that. It had been perfectly positioned on the edge of the shelf, leaning slightly to the right. I'd even tried shaking the bookcase once. Nothing ever budged. But now the lamp had fallen straight off. I was frozen. My heart pounded. I don't know what it was, but something didn't feel right. I glanced around the room trying to figure out how it happened. There was nothing obvious. No one else was here. I was alone. I walked over to the bookcase, my footsteps slow, almost cautious, like I was walking through a dream. I bent down to pick up the lamp, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. That's when I heard it, a whisper. It wasn't a voice, but more like a low hum, something barely audible. I froze again, not sure if I had imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. It sounded almost like my name. Jess! I stood up, my whole body tense. I turned in a circle looking for the source. There was no one there, just me and the empty apartment. I don't know why I did it, but I took the lamp and set it back on the shelf. I didn't even know why I cared about the damn thing. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had to. Maybe it was just habit, or maybe I was trying to force things back to normal, like it was all some mistake. I sat back down on the couch, trying to calm my breathing. I tried to focus on anything other than the silence, but the air felt different now, like something was watching me. The lamp didn't fall again that night, but that was the problem, wasn't it? The silence after the fall. It was suffocating, like something had been waiting for that exact moment to happen. And then nothing. I couldn't sleep after that. I tried, but I kept hearing things. Little creaks, like the floorboards shifting, or maybe a door opening somewhere in the apartment. But when I checked, everything was still. I stayed up all night, and when morning came, I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the lamp was still on the shelf. It didn't move. It wasn't until the next evening that I felt the chill again. I'd been out all day, trying to ignore the feeling from the night before. The apartment was quiet when I came back, and for the first time since that night, I felt the relief of being home again. I figured it was just stress messing with my head. But then I noticed something different. The lamp. It had moved. It wasn't much, just a small shift. Maybe a couple of inches, but it was enough for me to notice. The way it was leaning now, just slightly more off-center than before. I didn't touch it. I couldn't bring myself to. I had this overwhelming urge to leave the apartment, to get out and never come back. But I didn't. I stayed. I told myself it was nothing, just a draft, or maybe I was mistaken. That night I slept with the light on, but when I woke up, the lamp had moved again. This time, it was hanging off the edge of the shelf, its base barely touching the wood. I thought I must have been going crazy. I stood there for a long time staring at it, wondering if I was losing my mind. The rest of the room was as normal as it ever was. But that lamp, something about it was off. That's when I heard it again, that whisper. Jess! I turned around so fast my neck snapped, but there was no one there. I stood frozen, staring at the empty room. The air was thick, too thick, and then I felt it. An undeniable pressure, like someone was standing behind me, breathing down my neck. I could feel their presence, close, too close. I grabbed my things, rushed out for a few weeks till I came back. I've never been able to explain it, and I never will. Story 7. I was 16 and crashing at my mom's place for the weekend. I didn't have a room there, so I'd sleep on the couch in the living room. It sucked, but it was whatever. The real issue was my stepdad. He stayed up late watching TV, like all the time. I'd be lying there trying to ignore the bright glow of the screen, hearing his voice echo through the house, laughing at some stupid show or mumbling about whatever was on. Some nights he'd go on like that till 2 or 3 in the morning. But this one night, I don't know, something was different. I woke up, not because of the TV, but because there was this weird sound. At first I thought I was still dreaming, but then it came again. Louder this time. A man's voice, but it didn't sound right. It was off. I'm not sure what woke me up exactly. Maybe the way it sounded, like someone screaming but slurred, like they couldn't even get the words out right. Deb die. That's all I heard. My heart jumped in my chest and I froze, listening. I knew it was my stepdad's voice. It had to be. But something was so wrong about it. I mean, this wasn't just some random shout. It was like he'd lost it, completely. There was this desperation in his tone, like he was trying to scream for help but couldn't form the words. I sat up fast, holding my breath, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. The TV was still on in the background, but now I could hear this other noise, the sound of something crashing, maybe a chair tipping over, or something heavy hitting the ground. The voice came again, louder now. Deb die. I was already halfway off the couch before I realized I was moving. My legs were shaky, but I had to know what was going on. Was he hurt? Was he freaking out? I crept down the hallway toward his room. I wasn't sure if I should call out or just listen, but I needed to hear more. What was that voice? What was he trying to say? I could see the light under his door, and I could hear him now, more frantic, yelling something I couldn't understand. I pressed my ear to the door, but I couldn't make sense of the words. His voice was so loud it felt like it was shaking the walls. My stomach twisted. He was scared, and for the first time, I felt afraid of him. I pushed the door open a crack, just enough to peek inside. The room was a mess, papers scattered on the floor. The TV was on, but the sound was muffled by the screaming, the shouting. And then I saw him. He was standing by the window, his back to me, his hands pressed against the glass, like he was trying to hold it up. His shoulders were shaking, his head was down, but I could see his whole body tense, like he was straining against something I couldn't see. I wanted to call out to him, but I couldn't. I couldn't even move. The air felt thick, suffocating, like something was wrong in the room, like something was off about him. Deb die, he screamed again. But this time it wasn't just words. It was like a growl, like he was trying to fight something inside himself. The noise wasn't even human anymore. It was guttural, raw. I wanted to run, but I was frozen. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. His breathing was ragged now, and the strangest thing happened. His hands started to slide down the glass, leaving marks, like he was dripping something dark onto it. I don't even know if it was real, but it looked like blood. I couldn't handle it anymore. I slammed the door open the rest of the way, shouting his name. Dad! What the hell is going on? He didn't move. Not at first. It was like he didn't even hear me. Then slowly he turned his head toward me, and that's when I saw his face. His eyes were wide, pupils blown out, like he was in some kind of trance. His face was pale, but there was this hunger there, something empty behind his eyes, like he wasn't seeing me at all. He just stared at me for a moment, breathing heavily, And then he whispered, "Get out. Just get out." His voice was barely a whisper, but it was wrong. The words didn't come out right, like they were being forced through some kind of filter I couldn't understand. I took a step back, not sure if I should go for help or just run. My brain was spinning, trying to make sense of this. My stepdad, this guy who had always been just a little strange, but never dangerous, was not the man standing in front of me right now. This wasn't him. Then the room got cold, like freezing cold. I could see my breath. The temperature dropped so fast it made my skin prickle. I didn't even know how it happened, but everything around me started to feel wrong, like the house itself was breathing, pulsing with something alive. I could hear the faint sound of a low humming, almost like chanting, coming from somewhere inside the walls. My stepdad jerked his head back, his mouth opening wide. That's when I saw it, something in his mouth, something moving behind his lips. It was like a tongue, but not a normal one. It looked like it was twisting, slithering against his gums, trying to get out. I didn't stay long enough to see what happened next. I turned, ran down the hallway, and didn't stop until I was out the front door, gasping for air. Story 8. I was in 4th grade when I got lice. It was bad, really bad. My mom made me sleep on the floor, said it was to keep the lice from getting into my bed. She was strict about it. No way I was going to end up with them again. So every night I laid on the hard carpet, listening to the sounds of my parents in the next room. My bunk bed was only a few feet away, and even though it was supposed to be a comfort, the top bunk started to feel like a prison. One night I woke up at 3 a.m. I didn't know what woke me. Maybe it was the cold air or the feeling that something wasn't right. The house was eerily quiet, like even the normal creaks and groans had stopped. I rolled over, my eyes scanning the darkness. I always hated the dark, especially when I couldn't see the outline of my bunk bed above me. I turned my head, hoping to find something familiar. Maybe just a glimpse of the dim light from the hallway that always filtered through the crack in the door. But when I looked up, I froze. There was something crouching on my bed. At first, I thought it was my mom. Maybe she'd come in to check on me. But no, I could see enough of him, or whatever it was, to know it wasn't her. The man. The thing. It was crouched right there on the edge of my bunk, staring down at me. His eyes were wide open, completely white, like empty windows. No pupils, no irises. Just blank, pale, and lifeless. He wasn't even blinking, just staring. I could feel my heart pounding against my chest, but I couldn't move. My mouth was dry. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, but I couldn't. There was nothing about him that made sense. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I just kept staring at him, hoping that somehow this was just a nightmare. But the longer I looked, the more real it became. His skin. That's what I remember most. His skin was the worst part. It was a sickly gray, pulled so tight over his bones that it looked like paper. Like if you touched it, it might tear. His arms were thin, too thin, like they'd been starved, and his legs were bent in a way that didn't seem right, like his joints weren't made for moving that way. I could see every vein running underneath the surface, like his skin was stretched over the thinnest layer of muscle and bone. The most disturbing part was the spots, gray, sickly spots that looked like liver spots, all over his arms, his neck, and his face. It was like his skin was decaying right in front of me, but there was no smell, just the cold, suffocating stillness. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't look away either. My eyes were locked onto his, and it felt like he was staring right into my soul. I could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on me, suffocating me like I couldn't breathe. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. It was like I was frozen in place. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. My head felt heavy, like there was something pulling my gaze back toward him. I could feel my pulse in my ears, a loud thrum, as I tried to make myself wake up from this nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was real. I don't know how long I lay there staring at him, feeling his presence fill the room. It could have been seconds or hours. It felt like time had stopped. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I rolled over quickly, squeezing my eyes shut as tight as I could, hoping that if I just didn't look, he would disappear. I lay there, my heart racing, my hands trembling. I didn't dare open my eyes. I could still feel him there, like he was right behind me, watching me, waiting for me to turn back around. The worst part? I didn't hear him move, not a single sound. No creak of the bed, no shuffle of feet. It was like he was as still as the night itself. I stayed there, eyes shut, my face buried in the carpet, until the first light of dawn started to creep into the room. When I finally opened my eyes, he was gone. The room was empty, just the way it had been before I woke up. I never told anyone about that night. How could I? They'd think I was crazy, but I know what I saw. I remember those eyes, those empty, lifeless eyes staring down at me. Story 9. I lived in a small rented house on the outskirts of town, a place that always felt off. I don't know why, but something about it never sat right with me. It wasn't the size or the creaky floors. It was just this unsettling energy, like the house itself was watching. I moved in with my sister about 20 years ago, both of us barely out of our teens, trying to make it on our own. But from the moment we stepped inside, things started to feel strange. At first it was little stuff. The door to the laundry room would creak open sometimes when we weren't looking, or we'd hear footsteps in the hallway when we were alone. We brushed it off as the house settling or the wind messing with the windows. But then one day, I came home from work to find something that made my blood run cold. The house was silent, as usual, but there was something off about the atmosphere, a heaviness, like the air was thicker than normal. I passed the hallway mirror, glancing at the picture hanging next to it, me and my sister, taken on our last birthday. I always liked that picture. We looked happy, carefree, but when I saw it that day, I froze. The picture wasn't facing forward. It was turned around, the back of the frame against the wall. I remember standing there for a moment, trying to process it. The glass was still smudged, like someone had touched it recently, but no one had been there. I'd been at work all day, and my sister had left for her evening shift an hour before. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I picked it up, slowly turning it back around to face forward, and went about my evening, trying to shake off the chill that had crept over me. But the next morning, it was the same thing. The picture turned around again. This time I felt a knot form in my stomach, the unease crawling up my spine. I asked my sister if she'd been messing with it, but she swore she hadn't. The strange thing was that it didn't seem to matter how many times I turned it back. Every time I'd wake up or come home, it was facing the wall or turned upside down, like it was trying to hide itself. It wasn't long before I stopped sleeping well. Every night I'd wake up, heart pounding, with the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing things, scraping noises coming from the living room, like something being dragged across the floor. But when I'd get up to check, everything was in place. Then came the night it really escalated. I came home from a late shift one evening, exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. The house was dark, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside. The silence felt too deep, suffocating. I passed by the hallway and saw the picture again. But this time, it was different. The frame wasn't just turned, it was hanging crooked, almost as if it had been tugged on. My heart skipped a beat. I stood there, staring at it for what felt like forever, and then slowly approached it. Something told me not to touch it, but I did anyway. I reached for the frame and felt a chill that made my fingers tingle. As I straightened it, a gust of cold air hit me in the face, as if the house had suddenly exhaled. That's when I heard it, a whisper, soft but clear. A voice, not from the house, but from the air around me. "Get out!" I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The house felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in, the air thick with the weight of something unseen. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, as if some invisible force had me in its grip. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Get out!" It wasn't a request, it was an order, and it made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over the rug, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the picture. It was wrong. Something about it, something about the way it was positioned, felt off. I reached out, my hand trembling as I tried to pull it off the wall. But when I touched the frame, I felt it. Something sharp, something cold. I pulled my hand back in shock, and for a split second, I saw a faint, bloody handprint on the back of the glass. My stomach turned. I knew that wasn't my handprint. I hadn't touched it like that. I didn't even remember having blood on me. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that handprint. It wasn't just a smear. It was like it had been placed there, deliberately. And then, as I watched, the picture started to shift. The air in the room grew colder, and I saw the glass tremble. The edges of the frame, once still, began to wiggle as though something inside was moving it. The picture wasn't just shifting, it was alive. I ran out of the room, my breath coming in short gasps. I slammed the door behind me, trying to hold back the panic, but it felt like the house was breathing down my neck. I couldn't stay in there anymore. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong all along, and I hadn't seen it. I grabbed my phone and called my sister, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't even remember what I said. I was too shaken to form coherent sentences. She told me she'd be home soon, but I couldn't wait. I couldn't stay another second in that house. By the time she got back, I had packed up whatever I could grab. I was out the door and halfway down the street before she even knew what had happened. I never went back to that house, not even to get the rest of my things. We moved to a different place a few days later. I couldn't even look at the picture again. I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was just the house, or maybe there was something else there. But whatever it was, I know it didn't want us there, and it made sure we knew it. I lived in a small, rented house on the outskirts of town, a place that always felt off. I don't know why, but something about it never sat right with me. It wasn't the size or the creaky floors. It was just this unsettling energy, like the house itself was watching. I moved in with my sister about 20 years ago, both of us barely out of our teens, trying to make it on our own. But from the moment we stepped inside, things started to feel strange. But then, one day I came home from work to find something that made my blood run cold. The house was silent, as usual, but there was something off about the atmosphere. A heaviness, like the air was thicker than normal. I passed the hallway mirror, glancing at the picture hanging next to it, me and my sister, taken on our last birthday. I always liked that picture. We looked happy, carefree. But when I saw it that day, I froze. The picture wasn't facing forward. It was turned around, the back of the frame against the wall. I remember standing there for a moment, trying to process it. The glass was still smudged, like someone had touched it recently, but no one had been there. I'd been at work all day, and my sister had left for her evening shift an hour before. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I picked it up, slowly turning it back around to face forward, and went about my evening, trying to shake off the chill that had crept over me. But the next morning, it was the same thing. The picture turned around again. This time I felt a knot form in my stomach, the unease crawling up my spine. I asked my sister if she'd been messing with it, but she swore she hadn't. The strange thing was that it didn't seem to matter how many times I turned it back. Every time I'd wake up or come home, it was facing the wall or turned upside down, like it was trying to hide itself. It wasn't long before I stopped sleeping well. Every night I'd wake up, heart pounding, with the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing things, scraping noises coming from the living room, like something being dragged across the floor. But when I'd get up to check, everything was in place. Then came the night it really escalated. I came home from a late shift one evening, exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. The house was dark, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside. The silence felt too deep, suffocating. I passed by the hallway and saw the picture again, but this time it was different. The frame wasn't just turned, it was hanging crooked, almost as if it had been tugged on. My heart skipped a beat. I stood there staring at it for what felt like forever, and then slowly approached it. Something told me not to touch it, but I did anyway. I reached for the frame and felt a chill that made my fingers tingle. As I straightened it, a gust of cold air hit me in the face, as if the house had suddenly exhaled. That's when I heard it, a whisper, soft but clear, a voice not from the house but from the air around me. "Get out!" I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The house felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in, the air thick with the weight of something unseen. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, as if some invisible force had me in its grip. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Get out!" It wasn't a request. It was an order, and it made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over the rug, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the picture. It was wrong. Something about it, something about the way it was positioned, felt off. I reached out, my hand trembling as I tried to pull it off the wall. But when I touched the frame, I felt it. Something sharp, something cold. I pulled my hand back in shock, and for a split second, I saw a faint, bloody handprint on the back of the glass. My stomach turned. I knew that wasn't my handprint. I hadn't touched it like that. I didn't even remember having blood on me. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that handprint. It wasn't just a smear. It was like it had been placed there deliberately. And then as I watched, the picture started to shift. The air in the room grew colder, and I saw the glass tremble. The edges of the frame, once still, began to wiggle as though something inside was moving it. The picture wasn't just shifting, it was alive. I ran out of the room, my breath coming in short gasps. I slammed the door behind me, trying to hold back the panic, but it felt like the house was breathing down my neck. I couldn't stay in there anymore. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong all along, and I hadn't seen it. I grabbed my phone and called my sister, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't even remember what I said. I was too shaken to form coherent sentences. She told me she'd be home soon, but I couldn't wait. I couldn't stay another second in that house. By the time she got back, I had packed up whatever I could grab. I was out the door and halfway down the street before she even knew what had happened. I never went back to that house. Story 10. It was a calm evening, the kind where everything feels normal. The weather was fine, not too cold, not too hot. My mom, sister, and I were sitting outside eating dinner on the patio in our backyard. There wasn't much light except for the soft glow from the porch, and the smell of grilled chicken lingered in the air. Everything felt ordinary. We've always had a line of wires stretched between two wooden posts in the backyard, where we hang our clothes to dry. It was something my mom had set up years ago. Honestly, it was one of those features in the yard you kind of stop noticing after a while. The clothesline, just a part of the background. So there we were, eating, chatting, the sound of crickets and the occasional rustle in the bushes, the only interruptions. My sister was complaining about her day at school, typical stuff, and Mom was nodding along, not really paying attention, lost in her own thoughts. I was zoning out, watching the hangers sway gently in the evening breeze, hanging in a neat row on the wire. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, it happened. I'm not sure exactly when I first noticed it. It was just a small movement, almost like a trick of the light. But as I looked closer, I realized one of the hangers, the one in the middle, was moving. It was spinning. Slowly at first, but unmistakably spinning. I glanced at Mom. She saw it too. Her face went blank for a moment. Then she leaned forward, squinting as if trying to understand what she was seeing. "Are you seeing that?" she whispered, her voice cracking a little. I just nodded. I couldn't speak. It was so strange. The other hangers, the ones around it, they weren't moving at all. Nothing else was swaying, nothing was disturbed. The middle hanger was the only one spinning, and it wasn't a gentle spin, like the wind could have caused. It was steady, almost mechanical, like something was making it move. But there was no wind, not even a breath of air. Mom looked at my sister. My sister, eyes wide, was staring at the hanger too. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. We were all frozen for a second, just watching it. My brain couldn't quite process it. The hanger kept spinning. It was like it was alive, moving on its own. and the sound was unnervingly quiet. Just a faint squeak of plastic against the wire. Then I swear I saw something. It was like a shadow, a blur, passing through the middle hanger. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was imagining it, but no. There was something there, something that shouldn't have been. It wasn't just the motion. There was an energy, a presence. I couldn't explain it. Mum stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the stone patio. "Get inside," she snapped, her voice tense, almost desperate. We didn't need to be told twice. My sister and I jumped up and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My legs felt like they were moving on their own. I was halfway to the door when I heard it, Mum's voice trembling. She was still standing there staring at the hanger, her eyes wide and distant. "What the hell is that?" she whispered to herself, but it wasn't a question. It was more like a prayer, a plea. I grabbed the door handle, pulled it open, and without looking back, rushed inside. My sister was already at the kitchen table, staring out the window, too afraid to move. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking. We could see the backyard from the window, the line of clothes, the single hanger still spinning in the middle. It didn't stop, not for a long time. Mum came inside a few minutes later, her face pale, her eyes wild. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, breathing hard as if trying to process what had happened. She eventually sat down at the table, her hands gripping the edge like it was the only thing holding her together. Did you see it?" she asked us, her voice barely above a whisper. We all nodded. None of us spoke for a while. We just sat there trying to wrap our minds around it, but it didn't make sense. How could something like that happen? Why did it happen? The worst part wasn't the hanger spinning. No, it wasn't just that. It was the way the air felt right after. Everything felt wrong, like the world had shifted for a split second and we were no longer in the same place we had been before. Mum eventually tried to convince herself that it had just been the wind, that we had imagined it. But deep down, none of us believed that. We all knew what we had seen. We all knew it wasn't the wind. I don't stay long outside at night after that. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.